Good evening, everyone. We're going to be starting momentarily. Just going to wait about 30 seconds to let everyone in from the waiting room. And as we wait for folks to come on in from the waiting room, for those who are comfortable doing so, no obligation, no pressure. But for those who are comfortable doing so, let us know in the chat where you're joining us from tonight. So feel free to type in your city or town that you're watching live from. And we will start in about 15 seconds, okay? Let's see. Billerica, Tewksbury, North Andover, Methuen, Littleton. Oh, now I can't keep up. Georgetown, Atkinson, New Hampshire, North Andover, Westford, Raleigh, West Newbury, Beverly, North Andover, Boston, Chelmsford, Andover, North Andover, Atkinson, New Hampshire, Tewksbury, Phoenix, Arizona, care of Tewksbury, Beverly, Shirley, Georgetown, Littleton, North Andover, Methuen, Dracut, Connecticut. I'm going to stop there, but we got another 50 or so in the chat. That's wonderful. Great crowd tonight. I think you're really going to enjoy tonight's program. My name is Robert Hayes. I'm the Community Outreach Librarian and Head of Technical Services at the Tewksbury Public Library. My phone is ringing. I'm going to hang up on this person. Great. So I want to thank you all for joining us. I just have a few brief words, and then we'll get to the good stuff. First off, just know that we are recording tonight's events, and we are in Zoom webinar mode, so none of the audience's faces or names will be captured in this recording. But I am supposed to tell you that we are recording tonight's presentation. If you have any questions or comments for Dyke, you can type comments into the chat and questions into the Q&A. To sort of set expectations, Dyke is going to speak for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll take roughly 15 to 20 minutes of questions, and we anticipate wrapping up by 8 o'clock. So if you have comments for Dyke, you can type them into the chat. If you have questions for Dyke, you can type them into the Q&A, and I will relay those questions to Dyke at the very end. You can type away during the presentation, but we won't address the comments or the questions until the very end. All right, and just a note, I will be sending an email to everyone who registered tomorrow with a link to a feedback survey. Please take 30 seconds to fill out that survey. Let us know what you thought of tonight's event and what you'd like to see for future events. And I will share that survey with all the libraries involved in tonight's events. And I will list those libraries momentarily. But let's get to the good stuff here. So tonight's presentation is entitled History of the Merrimack River and How to Clean It Up. Local author and journalist Dyke Hendrickson will discuss his brand new book, Merrimack, the Resilient River, an illustrative narrative of the most historic river in New England. Dyke is the outreach librarian for the Merrimack River Watershed Council. In that role, he speaks on the history of the Coast Guard and of the Merrimack River. He graduated from Franklin and Marshall College with a degree in history, and he did graduate work at the University of Maine. He is a former writer and/or editor with the Portland Press Herald, the New Orleans Times, the Boston Herald, and the Daily News in Newburyport. And I just want to note that tonight's program is sponsored by the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library, and it's presented in a collaboration with several libraries in the area, including Atkinson, New Hampshire, Beverly, Dracut, Georgetown, Hudson, New Hampshire, Littleton, Medford, Merrimack, Methuen, Middleton, North Andover, Raleigh, Tewksbury, Tingsboro, and Westford. Whew, that's exhausting. I'm out of breath here. So all 150 of us or so that are watching live, let's give a big virtual round of applause to Dyke for joining us here tonight. And Dyke, the floor is yours. You can take it away. Thanks so much.
Well, thank you very much, Robert, and thank you for having me on this presentation. I live in Newburyport, which of course is the beginning of the river. And in recent years, I was covering the waterfront and City Hall in Newburyport for the Daily News. While this was happening, as a journalist, I was able to see that sometimes the river was getting dirtier, not cleaner. And so because I had covered this quite a bit, I got a contract to write a book about it, and it just came out this week, actually, Merrimack, the Resilient River. So I'm going to be talking tonight about the history of the river, some of the reasons why it is getting dirtier, not cleaner, and then also discussing some of the things being done to clean it up. The river was not founded. The river was discovered in 1605 by Samuel de Champlain. The French did not stay here, however. The English settled the North Shore. And in 1635, the town of Newberry was founded. Now, in 1764, the folks who lived near the water, they were called watersiders, in Newburyport, created Newburyport itself. And so this goes way back. Merrimack was an Indian word which meant place that where the water moves quickly. And that was mostly upstream, part of it New Hampshire, part of it before the mills got here. I did name it the Resilient River, the book, because over the years, the Merrimack has survived quite a bit. The mills came to the Merrimack in a big way in the 1820s. Then that was in Lowell in about the 1840s. Lawrence had many mills, and there were locks, there were dams, and even going back to the 40s and 50s, the river could get quite polluted. In fact, some old timers I talked to said, sometimes up near Lowell or Lawrence, the water would look orange because they were doing an orange textile that day, or it might look purple. So the river has really been resilient, partly because it's a strong current coming east, but then the ocean itself has significant tide. So much of the river, at least below Haverhill, gets washed out from time to time. And right now it's at a high point of recreational use. Here you can see the Merrimack River. It starts in Franklin, New Hampshire. It comes down through Manchester, through Nashua. Then at Lowell, it takes a turn to the east. And so it's 117 miles long. It's one of the most historic rivers of New England. And we're going to talk about some of the reasons why it was so historic. One of them is that the Merrimack River and Newburyport was the largest shipbuilding center in the colonies, say from 1760 to 1820. Samuel Eliot Morison, the great U.S. historian, said that there was no community that had more shipbuilding than the Newburyport area, which of course Amesbury, Salisbury, and going upriver, they also were manufacturing. This is from 1852. You can see how large the vessels are. The artist is Richard Burke Jones. He is a city clerk in Newburyport, but he's much more than the city clerk, as you can tell. He's quite a historian, but this is what Newburyport looked like in 1850 when it was among the largest shipbuilding communities in the colonies. Here we have one of the last tall ships in Newburyport, built in about 1893, the Symington. And you can see what a big day it was. Women in the foreground have gotten dressed up, there are kids, there's a horse and buggy I see. And just the size of this vessel is quite remarkable. Look at all the people that are on top of it. Now, one of the reasons why Newburyport did not make a transition into the age of steam with iron and steel ships, because the river is very shallow. The opening of the river is 12 to 16 feet at low tide. And if a vessel like this, which was very heavy, left the river, it could not come back loaded with cargo. So this is one of the last big ships. It could not come back. Of course, the masts were put on a little later, but you can just see the great excitement and the number of people involved in Newburyport and other communities as well in the Merrimack when a ship was going to sea. Later, the Pawtucket Falls in Lowell became discovered, I would say. And this was a period of time when hydropower was being harnessed. And Lowell and then Lawrence and some of the communities on the Merrimack really were the leaders in the country of harnessing the hydropower, making the mills run, and creating textiles. And it's said that this area along Lowell, Lawrence, Haverhill, etc., Manchester, was among kind of the Silicon Valley of the day. And it seems funny, but it just shows they were early on to hydropower, and they harnessed the Merrimack River. Henry David Thoreau, however, took offense, and he wrote a book in 1839 called 2 Weeks on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers. It was published in 49, but he did write it in 1839. But anyway, he loved the Concord River when he went up the Concord River. But when he got to the Merrimack, and this is 1839, he saw many mills there, and he saw many dams, and he saw locks being built and the river being redirected. And he said, this is not going to be good for fish. The salmon, the sturgeon, it doesn't look good. And he was right, of course. But the Merrimack Valley went on to be one of the largest textile manufacturers in the world. Here's the Spigot River in Lawrence. You can see this is late 19th century. There were many textile mills. There was the railroad had arrived. There was transportation had improved. And this is an example of a community in Lawrence becoming a very dynamic economic area. Now, to me, it's a two-way sword about the value of the mills. And modern historians say they were exploitive and they took advantage of children. And this is true. But there's also the case of many families found jobs here. The Irish had the famine in 1840s and 1850s. Many came here and worked in the mills. There were Jews in Russia and Poland who were driven out, and they came to the Merrimack Valley. So this valley and this system really provided a great number of jobs. It gave families a new chance in life. And so in my view, at least, it cuts both ways. The mills did become exploitive. There had to be a major strike in 1912, the Bread and Roses strike. But basically, it did provide jobs for many people. Here's a wonderful mill clock, which you folks probably have seen in Lawrence. In those days, most workers did not have pocket watches. So not only did it tell the time for people, but it let them know when their shifts were going to start and when they had to be somewhere. So these are, wonderful photos from the day. And it just shows that thousands of people were working at that time. Now, this is the Merrimack River. We know it to be a benign waterway in many cases, but sometimes it could really be a dangerous waterway. This was in 1936. It was a great flood, as you can see. This is Manchester. That's the Ameskeag Manufacturing Company. The Ameskeag was about finished by 1936. It was losing workers. It was a little more expensive than the South, but you can just see that this was a knockout blow, and there was the river doing tremendous damage. It wasn't just to the Merrimack, though. It was the rivers in Maine overflowed, the Connecticut River. But this, is a wonderful dynamic photo from 1936 of the Merrimack. The Merrimack, of course, can be serene and wonderful, but for boaters, it takes experience, and because there's a sandbar just about every year. I think you can see that in the foreground. And many folks coming up to Merrimack, they come in and they're not aware of it. It's low tide, and they can get caught on that sandbar. And if you're caught there, you might be there till the next tide. So it just shows how beautiful the river can be. It's given, each summer, there's about 1,500 pleasure craft registered in Newburyport, about 500 more in Amesbury, Salisbury, and going up river. But this is the Merrimack on a good day. The Coast Guard is a big story on the Merrimack. The Coast Guard was actually founded here. The Newburyport is the birthplace of the Coast Guard. And what happened was in 1789, George Washington, President Washington, went to Alexander Hamilton, who was the Secretary of the Treasury, and he said, "Hamilton, we have no money." And Hamilton said, well, I have an idea. Why don't we create a revenue cutter service? And so Washington asked him to please explain. So Hamilton was from the West Indies. He knew a lot about trade, and he had seen a lot of smuggling and probably cooking the bills of lading. And he said, why don't we get 10 revenue carriers? We'll build them about 60 feet. They'll go out in New England, off of the ports in New England and the other colonies, and they'll stop smuggling and they'll board ships and make people pay the appropriate amount. So Washington approved, and in 1790, 10 revenue cutters were approved. The first revenue cutter was built and launched in Newburyport, which is why this community is the birthplace. Now, there are outliers out there, Salem, Boston, Annapolis, Philadelphia, who occasionally say they are the birthplace of the Coast Guard. But the fact is, President Lyndon Johnson in 1965 signed a proclamation which said Newburyport is the birthplace. The Massachusetts was built there. It was the first revenue cutter to be launched. And so Newburyport is the birthplace. I would mention that many other communities have said that, but Newburyport has moved on. The word Coast Guard first came into use in 1915, because as we said, they were revenue cutters. The revenue cutter service in 1915 merged with the life-saving service. And then in 1939, these two merged with the lighthouse service. So there you are. The Coast Guard, the name came along in 1915, and Newburyport is the birthplace. The Merrimack can be certainly very beautiful. This is the Amesbury area, and on a summer day, it's a beautiful thing. A Maudsley State Park is across the way. That's, one of the great assets. It is a state park, as I say, and it certainly enables parts of the Merrimack to look very picturesque. Many communities are making a comeback in recent years. Most people say that after the Clean Water Act of 1972 was passed, many communities got better sewage treatment plants and better sewage treatment programs. Haverhill has made a significant comeback in recent years. Here you can see new buildings. UMass Lowell has some classrooms. Northern Essex Community College has some classrooms. There are apartments, there are business offices. So Haverhill on the river is doing quite well and using, as they say, the river as a centerpiece. In Lowell, the National Park Service has a wonderful national historic area. Not this year, this vessel is not running because of COVID, but in recent years, the Park Service runs vessel in the summer so staffers can tell visitors about the river and its storied history. Again, the mills started in Lowell in the 1820s. They started in Merrimack in the 1840s. And again, this is one of the biggest textile manufacturers in the country. Merrimack starts in Franklin, New Hampshire. I actually went to, travel from Franklin, New Hampshire down to Newburyport at different times. But here you can see how beautiful it is up in New Hampshire. Probably looked like this 200 or 300 years ago. So it's certainly a river with many different faces. It has a rural bucolic face like this. And of course, we have mills and tourist areas downriver. Here is where the Nashua River meets the Merrimack. This is there are 11 to 12 tributaries of the Merrimack, and the Nashua River is one of them. I took this photo, and I remember I was walking through a hospital parking lot, and this fellow was sitting in a lawn chair. And I said, geez, I'm trying to find the Nashua River. Where does it mix with the Merrimack? And he says, well, walk into that woods. Don't fall off of the sand cliff there. Stick your head out and take a picture. So that's what I did. But here's where the Nashua merges with the Merrimack in New Hampshire. Manchester, New Hampshire, of course, has been a major factor for many, many years. It's the largest city on the river. It provides the most pollution on the river, which we will talk about. And it also still generates a lot of energy. There are scores of small energy plants along the Merrimack even today that provide us with electricity. There's another element of the Merrimack that I was impressed to hear, that today more than 500,000 people still get their drinking water from the Merrimack River. So even though we hear about things are polluted, of course they have good science, but it does put an edge on our need to, be aware that 500,000 people are still getting drinking water. It's used for many sources. So an emphasis must be placed on keeping the river clean. This is Lowell. Lowell, of course, has also improved over the years. This shot shows you some of the ways that cement and engineering have come to play. Sometimes they dam the river so they can get more energy the next day. That's Yule Lowell off to the right, a dorm. Lowell, certainly upriver from the mills, has become a recreational area that many residents like. And you can see the numerous activities. There's fishing, there's a jogger. I think some people are walking a baby. And, Lowell has some, beautiful spots along the Merrimack. Another shot of Lowell, you can see that some of the buildings are still being used, some have been refitted. And if I ever get a spare time, I know that the textiles were a very big industry, but I think the brick making industry must have been huge as well. Because if you've been on 495 going past Lawrence, for instance, you can see the extraordinary number of brick mills. And here's another situation. So the mills were an enormous place for jobs in the old days. And if I get a minute, I'm going to look into brick making. Manchester, New Hampshire, like other communities, is much improved over the years. This is looking across the way. And to the lower right, you can see some of the old mill buildings. They've been repurposed. They're behind it. There are hotels and there are banks. And Manchester, as you may know, is quite a vibrant city. Now, one of the great events of the Merrimack took place a couple summers ago in Franklin, New Hampshire. It started a group of 12 to 14 elected officials and public officials started in Franklin and kayaked from Franklin, New Hampshire, all the way down to Plum Island in Newburyport. Here is State Representative Jim Kelcourse in the lead. That's Lane Glenn, who is president of Northern Essex Community College, behind him. So they made a great effort to bring attention to the river. They wanted to, on one hand, note that the river is a great asset. And you can see here how beautiful it is and how interesting it is to go down. But each evening, after they did about 30 or 35 miles, they would pull up their kayaks and they would meet with the press and meet with local officials and talk about the need to keep the Merrimack clean. Here's another shot of the voyagers. As I say, there were a dozen or 15 who may have made the whole trip, which was 4 days and 4 nights, and others, including Mayor Donna Holliday of Newburyport, maybe went on for a shorter period of time. But it was a remarkable event. They were exhausted and it rained 2 nights and, they thought they'd camp out, cook out the old hot dog, but it rained very hard 2 of the nights. They had to scramble for dinner and they had to scramble to find places to stay over, but they did get to Newburyport. And here is Newburyport Harbor. This is the end of the river. In recent years, as we said, it's become a major area for boating, for just recreation. And, people who grew up in, say, the 40s and 50s remember that when they were kids, say, swimming in the river or near the river, if they fell in, they'd have to run home and the mother would throw them in the bath immediately. Falling in the river was very polluted in the 40s and 50s and other times. But here's a shot that shows you the Merrimack has certainly cleaned up and is an attraction for many people. Here's a shot. You folks might know this. Merrimack and Amesbury come together, a beautiful part of the river. Fishing has diminished somewhat in the Merrimack. A century or 2 ago, there were scores of fishing boats, not just in Newburyport, but all the way upriver. The fishing diminished for several reasons. The federal government has much stronger minimums now. The fish have disappeared to some degree. I don't blame that on local fishermen, by the way. I mean, I remember those trawlers from Japan and Norway would be, 200 miles off the coast and taking in, they were called factory ships, actually, taking in a tremendous amount of fish. But Newburyport was, and many of the communities were big fishing areas. And in 1852, I remember there was one story. It was called the Yankee Gale. And there were hundreds of vessels out, in late autumn from here, from Boston, say, to the Maritimes. A gale came up, and of course, no one could predict it. And 92 vessels were lost in the Yankee Gale, and 24 of them were from Newburyport. So you can imagine the sadness and the travail that must have occurred, not just this time, but many fishing vessels were lost, many large, tall ships were lost going to India or whatever. But losing a mother, losing a father or a husband or a son was a frequent situation in the old days along the Merrimack. And here's another shot of what we talked about. Now, this is showing a great deal of energy and glee as appeared. That's State Representative Jim Kelcourse in the rear, State Senator Diana DiZoglio in the bow. So they were part of the Voyagers. And I love this shot. This must have been one of the relaxed moments, because I know many of them said, boy, I'm so tired. I can, hardly, get another mile to where we're supposed to camp. But we catch them here at a good moment. Now, one of my heroes in the Merrimack River story is a woman named Ellen Swallow. And if you're going to be in the field of drinking water, having the name Ellen Swallow is a wonderful name to have. She married her professor, who was named Professor Richards. So Ellen Swallow Richards was an all-star. In the 1880s, there was much typhoid going on along the Merrimack and Lawrence particularly. They did cleanse the water for drinking, but the science wasn't that great, and young people died. Now, the less wealthy people lived along the river, and the wealthier lived inland where they had their own wells. But Ellen Swallow Richards was on a team put together by the governor of Massachusetts to improve the science of drinking water. And she was the first woman graduate of MIT, and there were other men on the team, but because she just stands out to me. She's also known as the mother of home economics, because she brought ideas of balanced meals and a clean kitchen into homes in Cambridge where she lived. She also started a free lunch program in Cambridge. Now, this is 1890. So she was ahead of her time. She was terrific. And she created the science of clean drinking water, which worked in Lawrence, say 1890, was picked up in Lowell and many of the local communities, and actually went nationwide. So she is a tremendous hero in the history of clean drinking water in the country, and certainly on the Merrimack River. Ed Muskie of Maine sponsored the Clean Water Act of 1972. Now, here we start talking about how and why the river started getting clean. In 1969, there was a terrible event in Ohio. The Cuyahoga River caught fire. This is true. Some of you may remember it made the cover of Time magazine. There was so much effluent and so many chemicals in this river, it caught fire. And it really just jolted people in Washington. And they started doing something. And Ed Muskie was one of the ones who really became a leader in the Clean Water Act. Now, he ran for vice president in 68. He tried to become president in 72. Neither succeeded. But he did stick with it with the Clean Water Act. And in 1972, it passed. And, we know the environmental movement or environmental concerns, and Earth Day is upon us. But back in the early 70s, there wasn't much of an environmental movement until Muskie and the Clean Water Act. At that time, they started giving billions of dollars in grants to local communities so they could build sewage treatment plants. And that's when things started to improve. And so Muskie was one of the great warriors of that period of time, and really did a lot, not just with the Merrimack, of course, but the rivers in Maine, the Connecticut River, the Hudson, the Mississippi. This was an enormous bill, and Muskie was a big reason why it happened. Another very successful politician who loved rivers was George Mitchell, who is still with us. He was from Maine, Waterville. He was from the Kennebec River area, and that river was quite polluted. But in 1987, he was able to engineer the 1987 amendments to the Clean Water Act. Now, what happened in 1987 was President Reagan wanted to get rid of the block grants for sewage treatment plants. And this would be a very terrible thing. So Mitchell said, can we not please compromise? If you want to get rid of the grants, that's okay. But let us have low interest loans so that communities can still work on the sewage treatment plants and try to make the rivers cleaner. And so Mitchell was able to do that. And there's still bills in Congress now that you can borrow federal money at about 1.5%. Now, Congresswoman Lori Trahan of the Lowell area, Seth Moulton from the North Shore, as we speak, they are trying to get low interest loans so that the river can remain clean. Now, several years ago, when we talk about, well, what's wrong with the river? Several years ago, the American Rivers, which is a nonprofit in Washington, said that the Merrimack was one of the 10 most vulnerable rivers in the country. And they said, I mean, some real heavy hitters were there too, the Hudson and the Mississippi. But they said there's three things wrong with the river. One is that there are chemicals coming in from new companies that are not regulated. Number two, they were concerned that so much construction was going on. It was putting a lot of runoff into the river because they were losing trees and losing fields. The other thing that is most tangible, in my view, is sewage overflows. In most sewage treatment plants, and that would be Haverhill, Lawrence, Lowell, Manchester, and others, their sewage treatment plants take sewage, but the pipes also come in and bring rainwater. So if you have a heavy storm, you're getting the sewage as you usually do, but millions of gallons of rainwater comes into the sewage treatment plant. It cannot handle everything. So it opens the doors and there's a discharge. This is called a combined sewage overflow. And so that's what is hurting us right now. And in climate change that we're seeing now, we're getting intense rainstorms, which are creating these overflows, and millions of gallons of effluent are going into the river. That's a major problem. So if it's, people say, well, should we go swimming? Well, if it hasn't rained for 7 days, then that's a possibility. But if it's been raining lately, and officials say this, it is wise not to go swimming. Now, Governor Baker just this winter signed a bill which said that the sewage treatment plants upriver have to alert folks all along the river from email or a website and tell people, oh, there was a big discharge from Lawrence, it was, 1.5 million gallons, be on the alert. So things are changing. That is an improvement. Paul Tsongas, of course, was a champion of Lowell, but of course he loved the Merrimack River. And this was a situation where he worked with other folks, and this is a period of time when money was going in to clean up the river. I love this shot, and some of you might remember this wonderful family. Nikki Tsongas herself became a congressional representative, but when I saw this photo, I said, this is so terrific, and they look so wonderful and young there. Senator Tsongas died at 56 in about 1997. Here is his grave site adjacent to the Merrimack. I mean, that's a beautiful site. It's a very poignant thought. He was a great worker for the North Shore, for the Lowell area, and everywhere where we live and work. And so this is this is his gravestone. The Whittier Bridge was one of the big assets that's come along in the recent years. I've seen $200 million, $92 million as a cost. I've seen $310 million as the cost, but whatever it was, this is very helpful to the Merrimack, and here's just a beautiful shot of the river. And this is what we don't like so much. This is, I think, in the Methuen area. This is not a sewage treatment plant situation. This is, runoff from the streets. But, you can see how the debris, you can see the shopping carts. We've all probably seen stories that they pick a tire out of the river, or they pick a car maybe, or hypodermic needles. So usually the river is a beautiful place, but sometimes it reminds us it has to be cleaned up. And here's Newburyport. This is right along the beautiful boardwalk. And here's another pipe to the lower left. This is not from the sewage treatment plant. This is from bringing water runoff into the river, but they're trying to diminish uses of that as well, because there's salt, there's grime, there's beer cans, there's everything. This is the beautiful part of the river. I think this is in the Haverhill, Amesbury area. And it just shows the river to be a great asset, but it also indicates that there's a lot of building going on. And, we're losing some of the forest, we're losing some of the open fields, but nevertheless, I think we recognize what an asset the river is. Here's another shot. This was taken by Dan Grovek, who is the chair of the Merrimack River Watershed Council. And, if we've been near the river, or, wherever you are, if you're in New Hampshire, if you're Haverhill, if you're down in Newburyport, they're beautiful sunsets on the river. Anna DeZoglio of Methuen has been a key leader in keeping the river clean. She was able to get legislation passed a year ago to create the Merrimack River Commission to improve the river. Now, I suspect when you woke up this morning, you did not expect to see a smiling face of former President Richard Nixon, but there he is on the left. That's Hubert Humphrey, of course, and Ed Muskie. But I put this here because we mentioned that in 1970, after the river caught fire, Nixon was actually momentarily a leader in environmental work. Under his watch, the Environmental Protection Agency was created in 1970 and 1971. So he does have that as an asset on his resume. But I did note that in 1972, when the Clean Water Act was passed, Nixon actually vetoed the Clean Water Act. Now, it did pass over his veto, but I had to give him credit. It was during his watch that the EPA was created, but then I saw, he did become quite a rogue as a result of Watergate, and he vetoed the Clean Water Act, but these two folks, Humphrey and Muskie, were able to have an over. The veto was overcast. And it is important to know that then and also now, political work is important. Your legislators, we've talked about a number of them. So the river can get cleaner, but it takes a lot of attention to it. Here we are about the end of the presentation. I thank you very much for listening. This is a beautiful spot from Moseley Pines in Newburyport. It's looking upriver towards Amesbury. And there's so many beautiful parts of the Merrimack. It's a vulnerable river, we've learned that. It's a historic river, and it's just one of the great things on the North Shore. And here's, this isn't really a plug, but since the cover came out so well, I just had to show it to you. This is a cover of my new book, Merrimack, the Resilient River. I started on the left, you can see it starts in New Hampshire, it ends in Newburyport. So that is my presentation. I've enjoyed talking to you. I know many of you know the river, your homes are near the river. And so at this point, I would conclude, and Robert, if there are any questions out there, I'd be glad to answer them.
All right, wonderful, Dyke. Thank you so much for your presentation, and we're right on time. So we're going to take roughly 15 minutes of questions, and then we're going to call it a night. Um, so first, I'm going to address some questions that were sent in via the chat. So I'm not sure everyone can see these. Stuart says, Dyke, the Europeans didn't discover the Merrimack River. The indigenous people were already here. Can you talk a little bit about the name Merrimack and where that comes from?
Yeah, that's a good point, and it is a faux pas on my part that I said that yeah, the Native Americans were here for many years. In the 18th century, however, like in many other parts of the country, the contagions and smallpox wiped them out in a rather rapid way. So they were here. You're correct. They lived here for centuries. Merrimack is an Indian word, as I understand, a place of fast movement or fast water. Now they must have been thinking upriver in the New Hampshire part, or maybe at that time in Lowell, before, of course, all the mills came along. But it was an Indian word. It was called Merrimack. And I must say, I had a question recently, and they said, well, Merrimack, the town, is spelled with a C, not a K. And many communities also have Merrimack Street with a C. But then I did note that in 1909, for whatever reason, the state legislature in Boston had a formal recognition that Merrimack River was going to be with a K. So to that part, I would say the Merrimack has a K, Merrimack, the town, has a C, and there's that.
Elena says, wow, these photos are such a treasure. My relatives, most of whom I didn't get a chance to meet, worked in these mills. We romanticize the now renovated mills, but I've read about how brutal the work hours, bosses, and owners could be.
Well, that's a wonderful comment, and I agree with you completely that, but in the mid 19th century and then towards it was bad. Child labor laws didn't exist at the time. But I also talked to a number of people. I did another book called Quiet Presence years ago, where it was about the French Canadians and how they came in and worked in the mills of Lewiston and Biddeford and Manchester and Lowell and Lawrence. And a lot of people felt that the mills had been good for them. It gave them jobs. Many mills enabled their children to come to work with them. Now, this does not mean that there weren't bad things in these mills. There were. And as we said, it created some of the earliest labor actions in the country. But in my view, and this is only my view, I don't even know if it's shared by that many people, it provided jobs for many Europeans coming here. They were destitute, they were broke, they needed jobs, and this is where they started.
Paul has a question. What role did the Merrimack play in the Revolutionary War and in the War of 1812, if any?
Well, I think not a great deal. I mean, I know that, we're north of Boston. There was it's not funny, it's an interesting story. There was in, say, 1775 or so, this English man of war was outside of the harbor here in Merrimack River. And so he didn't seem to know what he was doing. And so one of the captains on the shore said, why don't we go out there? We'll tell him it's Boston and we'll have him come in. And so that's what they did. The English captain says, we're looking for Boston. Can you, oh yeah, this is Boston. Don't worry about it here. And so on the way in, they were able to get their munitions. They were able to take over the vessel. And so they actually captured an entire man of war. So that's one story. But in terms of fighting or in terms of other armed battle, I don't know of too much that went on in Newburyport along the Merrimack.
Follow-up question or related question from James. During World War II, is there any evidence that spies entered from the Atlantic via the Merrimack River?
That's a great question because I'm just reading a book, Winston Churchill's memoirs, which is, it's 900 pages and that's abridged. But one whole section is how much submarine warfare and spy warfare took place on the Atlantic coast. But I don't know of any that took place on the North Shore here. I've never heard of a spy. I've never encountered it, but that's a good question. I'll be vigilant about that issue in the future.
Cynthia says, can't wait to read your book. Congrats on the launch. Thank you for sharing your knowledge with us.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much for the comment. One thing that I enjoyed, as I said, I've been a journalist for a long time and I covered the river, but I'd never been to every part of the river in every town. Now, I still haven't gotten to every town, but just to start in New Hampshire, Manchester, Concord, it was just an exciting experience, which, as I hope I've gotten this across, it's a wonderful asset. And, we're blessed to be part of it.
So Sandra is interested in learning more about Native Americans in the river. And Pat does have a question in those regards. Pat asks, can you tell us more about the Native Americans and their life along the Merrimack? After they were pushed out of the area, did they return to the river to fish? And what was the distance of the and I apologize for mispronouncing tribal locations and names. It's just terrible of me. The Amasakag and Pawtucket Falls.
I think one of the elements that existed, at least in the good days before the settlers came here, was the Native Americans used to come down, say, to Plum Island and do fishing. There were an enormous amount of fish there. They could camp along the water. They could cool off. They'd go back upland to, New Hampshire or the Lowell area, wherever. One of the great legends, strangely enough, about Native Americans in the river comes out of Haverhill. A woman named Hannah Dustin had been kidnapped with two of her children. This is about 1697, I'm thinking. And she was able to come to her senses. She took so they're sleeping along the Merrimack. They're taking them up to New Hampshire. Hannah takes out a hatchet and ends up killing 10 Native Americans and running away. And she ended up selling the scalps. Now, this is a very off-color story, I've got to say. And to top that off, she was supposedly the first woman in New England to have a statue erected in her honor. I know it's a weird story, but if you folks have been to Haverhill, the largest statue in a public park in Haverhill's Hannah, and she's actually holding an axe. So I didn't create the story. I'm just passing it along.
So Dyke, we got about 10 minutes and we have about 10 questions. We'll see how we do here. I do want to ask a bunch of environmental questions, but let me get the non-environmental questions out of the way. Andrew wants to know, well, let's go with Elliot. What's the history of steamboats on the river?
There is a history. In my book, I have a couple steamboats. There isn't much of one other than they weren't really built here because, as we've said, this is a very shallow river. So they would come up here, even in relatively modern times, I think into the 60s, if they weren't steamboats, at least they were tourist boats. They would come up here, give people rides. I have a picture, I think from the 1930s, where there was a steamboat along Merrimack Wharf there. But they weren't prevalent. There was quite a bit of trade going up to Haverhill, I will say. And for many years, there was a great deal of trade going up and down the river. I didn't mention that, but steamships, not steamships, paddle wheelers or whatever, did not have a significant history here.
Deb mentions in the chat that there's an article in the Lowell Sun today that says the federal government has allocated $67 million to address the river cleanup of the combined sewer outflows. And I'm going to attempt to link that article in the chat. This never goes well for me, but I'm going to attempt to share that. I think I found it. All right, let's do a couple more non-environmental questions. You mentioned the river is shallow. Mike wants to know, what is the elevation change between the start and end of the river? Did we stump you on that one, Dyke?
I remember at the old quiz shows years ago, don't I have 50 seconds to figure this out? Actually, I don't know the answer to that. Some places it's quite deep, down here, 12 to 16 feet. and I was in Lawrence last summer, and in parts that I was at, it was like wasn't more than 6 feet. So it probably runs from perhaps 30 feet in New Hampshire and changes on the way down to 12 to 16 feet at the aperture of the river.
All right, Joan says, what is the present condition of the river?
Now, that's a great question, because people are trying to get more scientific about this, in part because when you go to Washington and you ask for money, the legislators are going to say, well, what do you mean by pollution? And so a lot of the Watershed Council this spring took samples, and they're sending it off to different scientific laboratories. Many groups are working together. The Merrimack Valley Planning Commission is one of them, to get scientific facts marshaled together. Right now, there is no specific thing to say, what the danger is. We know there's pollution. We know there's these discharges effluent. Probably at this time next year, we'll have numbers, but at the moment that they don't quite exist yet.
So I think you just referenced one, but Carol wants to know, are there volunteer groups to assist in river projects?
Yes, and most communities have them. The Merrimack River Watershed Council that I just mentioned had a group, a dozen, and I know Lowell does, Lawrence does. I don't know their names, but frequently in the spring, you'll see young people out walking along the riverside. I mean, they're supervised, of course, but they're picking junk out of the river. And so there is a lot of young people are really ardent about this. They want to clean up the river. And so every community might have one. And if you wanted to look around, I would go on the website of the Massachusetts Environmental Protection Agency, and I think you could get some leads there.
So Pamela and Stuart are both asking about a plan to clean up the river. So I would point folks to the Lowell Sun article. Hopefully that's not behind a paywall. But Dyke, can you talk at all about the plan that's proposed to clean up the river?
Yeah, I mean, there are plans and there are plans. I mean, this is what we talked about. It's probably the low interest money. And now Manchester, New Hampshire, for instance, just entered into an agreement with federal and state environmental officials for a 20-year cleanup program of their treatment plant, $132 million, and that's part federal. So this money that you talked about is probably going to go to communities just like Manchester got. And the EPA knows there are big problems. Lowell, Lawrence, and Haverhill are all on record with this EPA and saying, the EPA is saying, you're in, not defiance, you're in violation of environmental standards. We've got to have a plan for you to improve your sewage treatment plant. So that, Robert, is probably what we're talking about. These communities are in violation. This money is going to help them. And so, it's a good thing that money is on the way. I would mention that the Trump administration had closed off many of these avenues. But as I say, Laurie Trahan and Seth Moulton, our congressional representatives, are going after that money. And I think there'll be an improvement.
Stephanie is a teacher at the Weatherby School in Lawrence. Her students are learning about the history of the Merrimack and creating PSAs for the community about cleaning it up. She'd like to know, did you include information about Lawrence in the Merrimack River in your book? And what other resources could you point her to? So that's the question from Stephanie.
Yes, I did have quite a bit about Lawrence. And I would, again, consider the State Environmental Protection Agency. They've been monitoring all communities. They were able to lead you to places. And there are many, many different communities and different activities going on, but I must say, I don't know what is happening in each community.
So we've reached the 5-minute warning. Barbara, I noticed your hand is raised. I'm not going to unmute anyone. So if you do want to ask a question, you're going to want to do that via the Q&A or via the chat. Paul wants to know, at what point in the river does the water change from salt to fresh?
That's a good question. I think a little below Haverhill, because as we said, one of the reasons why the lower part of the Merrimack has stayed relatively clean is because we have the tides coming in, going past West Newbury, just about to Haverhill. And on the other hand, we have the current coming down. So I would say the answer is between West Newbury and Haverhill, and it's brackish up to there. And then after that, of course, you begin getting more dams and things change.
DL has a potential fact check for you. He or she, I'm not sure, I would imagine he, says, I thought Hiram Mills, the creator of the Lawrence experiment station, was responsible for cleaning up the water and reducing typhoid. So what about Hiram Mills?
That's a wonderful question. And I say that because I happen to know the answer. As I said, Hiram Mills was the leader on that program. In fact, a sanitary treatment plant in that area is named after him. But as I did mention, I loved Ellen Swallow. I loved her name. I loved her presence. I picked her out, but she wasn't the only one. In fact, she may not even been the leader. It's just that I chose her because if you're a historian in New England, the women don't start turning up until, late in the 20th century. So I said, 19th century, there's a woman. She was brilliant. I'm going to focus on her. But, our questioner is definitely correct.
The only Hiram Mills I know is on a TV show called Riverdale, which is for teens. So no one on this call is going to get the reference. Let's see. Andrew wants to know, did the Merrimack Mills supply the U.S. military with uniforms and equipment through the years?
It did. And, in the Civil War, it had a part for, obviously the Union forces. Later, I think some of them made parachutes in World War II. There's a significant history of the different elements that were created along the river. I did use the word textiles and wools and shoes in Haverhill, but many things have been created over there. And I guess the big takeaway is hydropower of the Merrimack was crucial to many of these developments.
Alyssa wants to know, do you have any information or comments about the West Newbury Women's Club's effort to clean up the Merrimack between 1950 and 1980s?
Well, I've read about it. I don't have specific information. I think groups have always been concerned about the river, and it comes and goes. And at that period of time, things parts of it were getting better. But I think we know, just walking along Plum Island or walking along West Newbury, anywhere you can see things floating down. And you realize, wow, that shouldn't be in the river. About 4 or 5 years ago, this sewage treatment plant in Hooksett, New Hampshire, tried this new technology, which involved discs of about the size of a silver dollar. And they used them in the treatment plant, and the treatment plant shut down, and millions of discs went into the Merrimack River. And supposedly they've been found in Portugal and the Azores. I can't confirm that, but in Newburyport and in Salisbury, they still occasionally splash up. So there's always some strange thing in the river, and I think people are trying to do what they can to stop that type of thing.
All right, so Dyke, we've hit 8 o'clock. I am going to end it here, but I will include Dyke's email address tomorrow when I send out the link to the feedback survey. I'll also send out a link to the recording for anyone who had to attend late or leave early. So you will be able to watch it in its entirety tomorrow with the link I send. Let me pump your ego up, Dyke, and then I'll ask you one last question. So Judith says, thank you. This was great. Elena says, thanks for the recommendation of the book, The Bend, the River. Pat says, thank you. Let me see here. Where are all the thank yous? I think they came before. Michael says, thank you. Great talk. Love the Merrimack. Let's see. Where are we? Patricia says, great photos. Alan says, great presentation. Thank you very much. Cynthia says, thank you so much. I learned so much. Sarah says, this was so informative. Thank you so much. And we're getting a lot of similar messages as well, Dyke. Thank you so much. This is very informative, and I can't wait to read your book. I hope you don't mind if I reach out if I have a question. Jill says, interesting program. Thank you. And I'm going to leave you with one last question, which was asked by multiple people. But Elena asks, where can I buy a copy of your book?
Well, it's hitting the stores this weekend. I live in Newburyport. Jabberwocky is the main bookstore there. All bookstores along the river, I would like to think, are going to have it in because it's a major publisher. The cover looks good. Now, I might be an illiterate fool, but I think the cover looks good. So go to the bookstore, and if in doubt, it's on Amazon, of course. But thank you, Robert, for mentioning that. It is hitting the stores this weekend.
Yeah, so when I say new book, I mean hot off the shelves new.
That's right.
Again, want to thank the Friends of the Tewksbury Public Library for sponsoring, and I want to thank all our partnering libraries tonight, including Atkinson, Beverly, Dracut, Georgetown, Hudson, Littleton, Medford, Merrimack, Methuen, Middleton, North Andover, Raleigh, Tewksbury, Tingsboro, and Westford. All told, at the highest point, we were around 200 people live. Great turnout. Thank you so much, Dyke. Thank you all for joining us. Look for that email tomorrow morning, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of their night. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you very much, Robert, and thank you for taking part in this wonderful event about the Merrimack. Thank you.
Great. Thank you all. I'm going to end the call now. Everyone have a great night.